Should I use autofocus or should I use manual focus? Which one's better? Is there a time when one is better than the other? In this video, we're going to be talking about when to use autofocus and when to use manual focus and which one's better. By the way, if you can't tell, I'm currently moving, which is why there's a bunch of junk behind me and why I'm sitting on my floor. If you spend time with other videographers, a lot of times the debate between auto and manual focus will come up. Lots of people will say autofocus is the best thing since sliced bread, and some other people might say manual focus is the only way to go if you're a professional. And this might come as a surprise to you, but in my 5 years of owning a video business and my 15 years of shooting videos, I have found scenarios where I desperately needed autofocus and scenarios where I really preferred manual focus. So autofocus is when your camera decides what to focus on and then communicates with your lens electronically to set the focus so that that point or that object or that thing, whatever you've decided to set your focal point on or decided to track, is in focus. For someone like me, I shoot a lot of weddings, or if you're doing a lot of run and gun style shoots, events, or things where you can't do a second take, autofocus is a great option. For instance, when the bride is walking down the aisle at her wedding, I'm not going to stop and say, hey, I missed focus. We need to shoot this again. You know, you've got one chance to get that shot. I've used manual focus in those moments before, specifically times where I have a certain shot in mind or go from blur to in focus as the bride is coming into frame. But 80 to 90% of the time on those important shots at a wedding, I'm going to use autofocus because I can just tap on the bride's face on my little camera screen and it will track her the whole way towards me, keep her in focus, and I don't even really have to think about it. I can just focus on my framing and my stability. I've even used autofocus in studio settings just to set the focus, and then I hit the little manual switch on the lens to switch it into manual so I know it won't get messed up or the autofocus won't freak out and try to focus on something else in the moment. And that does raise a good point. Sometimes autofocus doesn't really work right. Now it's 2025 and most of the time autofocus has no problem. I've rarely had an issue with it with the Sony FX3 and the Sony FX30. Maybe sometimes in low light conditions it'll freak out and just kind of go between its maximum and minimum distances. But for the most part, in this day and age, autofocus is really dialed in and is a really solid tool that videographers, camera operators can use. Now, manual focus is really, in my opinion, where you can get more artistic, more selective, and it's less restrictive. A lot of times when I'm filming in autofocus, I have my camera set so that there's a little box in the middle of my display screen that the camera will focus on whatever in that box. Now I can move that box around with a little joystick so I can say, hey, I want to focus, up here, or I'm going to focus on this object in the foreground, and then I can rack it to the background. So there are options to work with autofocus and still get creative shots, but sometimes when I'm using autofocus, I won't do certain shots because I know that my focal point is by default in the middle of my screen. Whereas in manual focus, I can just say, I want to focus on this object in the foreground. I'm going to pull my focus and then I can, rack from there or keep that in focus for the shot. Or in other words, autofocus is really easy and does 75% of the work really well, but that last 25% can be kind of restricted to your creativity. So you have to make creative decisions on when you're going to use something like autofocus versus manual focus. If you're on set doing a paid gig, shooting an interview, or in studio, 99% of the time you're going to use manual focus. Although, like I said, sometimes I'll use autofocus to just make sure my focus is perfectly set, and then I'll switch to manual so that it doesn't go nuts and focus on something else. In those instances, hopefully you have a camera operator or someone who can pull focus for you so you don't really have to even worry about that. And if you don't, or if you do, there are tools that you can use to make pulling focus manually a lot easier, especially when you're using a cinema lens. They tend to have longer focus throws than something like this that I'm shooting on, the Sony 24-70. You can also use powered focus pullers, even wireless focus pullers. That's what I use most, the little Tilta focus pulling kit. It comes with a little motor and a little handheld dial that you can use to pull focus wirelessly and remotely. And using those kind of tools can make it a lot easier and make your focus pulling a lot smoother. But again, if you're shooting something like a wedding, you're not going to be pulling focus the entire day. And if you are and you have one of those attachments on your rig, that just makes your rig that much bigger. And again, for a wedding, I'm trying to think compact. I'm trying to think I'm shooting for 8 to 10 hours. I need everything I need in this location. Any more gear on my rig is going to add more weight. For an 8 to 10 hour day, that's a lot. That doesn't mean don't do it. That doesn't mean don't try it. This is all just stuff that I've kind of learned and my habits after running my business for 5 years and shooting videos for about 15 years. So in summary, as a videographer or camera operator, there are going to be times where autofocus is incredibly helpful to you. If you're shooting weddings, I highly recommend getting a good, fast autofocus lens. If you're strictly doing studio work, autofocus lenses probably aren't at the top of your list. There are probably other things you should buy before experimenting with autofocus in studio. But the important thing is to understand that it's not really a rule that you need to only use autofocus. A lot of times with this lens I'm using now, I'll switch it into manual and just manually with my hand change the focus for shots. I do that at weddings sometimes. I do that for jobs in studio as well. These are just some musings on autofocus and manual focus, something that several people have asked me about on Instagram, and I figured I'd make a video about this. So if you got any help from this, or if you enjoyed the video, please hit like, please subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it helps grow my channel and encourages me to make more videos. I'll see you in the next video.